Good evening. Welcome back to my channel. The early morning fog clung to the gardens of Kensington Palace like a veil, softening the sharp outlines of the ancient stone walls. Inside apartment 1A, Catherine, Princess of Wales, sat beside a window overlooking the palace grounds. A stack of folders rested neatly on the table beside her tea. Catherine rarely rushed into anything. Every decision she made was thoughtful, measured, the quiet kind of leadership that people sometimes underestimated. But not today. Today required precision. The door opened gently. "Good morning," came the warm voice of Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. Catherine looked up and smiled. "You're early." Sophie stepped inside, removing her coat as the faint scent of London rain followed her into the room. "I thought we agreed early was necessary," Sophie replied lightly. They both knew the truth behind the humor. What they were about to do would change the balance inside the royal household. For years, Sophie had quietly earned a reputation as one of the most trusted figures in the royal family. Steady, discreet, loyal. When the late Queen Elizabeth II was alive, Sophie had become one of her closest confidants. Catherine had noticed that. She had also noticed something else. The palace was changing. Since the coronation of King Charles III, the dynamics inside the monarchy had shifted dramatically. And the rise of Camilla, Queen Consort, had created tensions that few outsiders understood. Catherine gestured toward the folders. "I've been reviewing the new patronage requests," she said. Sophie sat down across from her. "That many?" Catherine nodded. "More than we can realistically handle." Sophie flipped open the top folder. Inside were requests from charities across Britain, children's hospitals, environmental groups, veterans organizations. The monarchy had always depended on charitable patronage. But something unusual was happening. Many of these organizations were asking specifically for Catherine or Sophie, not Camilla. Sophie raised an eyebrow. "Interesting." Catherine leaned back slightly. "They're asking because they believe we'll show up." Sophie gave a soft, knowing smile. "And because they know you connect with people." Catherine shrugged gently. "I just listen." But listening was powerful. And it was exactly what made their quiet plan possible. Across London, the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace felt very different. In a private sitting room overlooking the courtyard, Queen Camilla stood reading a briefing document. Her expression darkened. The document listed upcoming royal engagements. Next to many of them were the names Catherine and Sophie. Camilla placed the paper down. "This is becoming ridiculous." Her private secretary hesitated carefully. "Ma'am?" Camilla turned sharply. "When did it become acceptable for junior royals to dominate the schedule?" The secretary chose his words with precision. "The Princess of Wales is extremely popular with the public." Camilla's jaw tightened. "And Sophie?" "The Duchess of Edinburgh has been quietly taking on additional duties." Camilla walked toward the window. For decades, she had fought to be accepted, to move from scandal to legitimacy. Now she was queen. And yet, the spotlight seemed to follow Catherine everywhere. Camilla exhaled slowly. "I want a meeting arranged." "With whom, ma'am?" Camilla's eyes narrowed. "Catherine." 2 days later, Catherine arrived at Buckingham Palace. The meeting room was formal but elegant. Camilla sat at the far end of the table, poised and composed. Catherine entered with her usual calm grace. "Your Majesty." Camilla gestured for her to sit. "Thank you for coming." There was a moment of polite silence. Then Camilla spoke. "I've been reviewing the royal schedule." Catherine nodded. "So have I." Camilla studied her carefully. "You and Sophie seem to be taking on a great deal." Catherine's expression remained gentle. "There's a lot of work to be done." Camilla leaned forward slightly. "And yet it appears many organizations are bypassing the palace to contact you directly." Catherine didn't react immediately. Instead, she answered thoughtfully. "They reach out because they want support." Camilla's voice cooled. "The monarchy requires structure." "And compassion," Catherine replied softly. The words hung in the air. For a brief moment, Camilla saw something she hadn't expected. Strength. Not defiance, but quiet certainty. It unsettled her more than open confrontation would have. Later that afternoon, Sophie arrived at Kensington Palace again. Catherine was waiting with tea. How did it go? Sophie asked. Catherine smiled slightly. Exactly as expected. Sophie laughed softly. She's feeling the pressure. Catherine nodded. Their strategy wasn't about confrontation. It was about presence. While Camilla focused on traditional royal ceremonies, Catherine and Sophie were expanding their roles in areas the public deeply cared about: mental health, early childhood development, veterans' welfare, women's support programs. They weren't competing, but their work naturally drew attention. Sophie picked up one of the folders. You realize what's happening, don't you? Catherine tilted her head. Public trust? Sophie smiled. You're becoming the future of the monarchy. Catherine looked out the window. The weight of that truth was enormous. But she had never wanted power. She wanted stability. For the monarchy. For Prince William. For their children, Prince George of Wales, Princess Charlotte of Wales, and Prince Louis of Wales. And for the country. 1 week later, a quiet announcement appeared in the press. Catherine and Sophie were launching a new joint initiative supporting military families. The program would involve partnerships with charities across Britain. The response was immediate. Newspapers praised the collaboration. Social media exploded with support. Royal commentators called it a modernizing moment for the monarchy. Inside Buckingham Palace, Camilla read the headlines with growing frustration. Catherine and Sophie redefine royal service. Future of the monarchy takes shape. Public rallies behind new royal partnership. Camilla closed the newspaper sharply. They're positioning themselves. Her advisor spoke carefully. With respect, ma'am, they're simply doing the work. But Camilla understood optics. And optics mattered. At Windsor Castle, Prince William listened quietly as Catherine described the recent events. He poured 2 cups of tea before sitting beside her. You knew this would happen, he said gently. Catherine nodded. I didn't want conflict. But you knew it was inevitable. Catherine sighed softly. The monarchy has to evolve. William smiled. That sounds like something my grandmother would say. Catherine laughed quietly. I hoped she'd approve. William looked at her with deep admiration. You're handling this perfectly. Catherine shook her head slightly. I'm just trying to do the right thing. William squeezed her hand. That's exactly why people trust you. Weeks passed. The pattern continued. Every appearance Catherine and Sophie made drew enormous crowds. Their approach was warm, approachable, modern. Camilla's engagements remained traditional, formal, distant. One evening, Camilla sat with King Charles in a private sitting room. Charles looked tired but thoughtful. You seem troubled, he said. Camilla hesitated. It's Catherine. Charles raised an eyebrow. What about her? She's quietly taking control of the monarchy's public image. Charles leaned back. And that worries you? Camilla frowned. It should worry you too. Charles smiled faintly. On the contrary. Camilla stared at him. Charles spoke calmly. It reassures me. Camilla blinked. Charles continued. The monarchy must survive long after we're gone. He looked toward the window. And Catherine represents that future. Camilla said nothing, but she understood the message. The tide of public affection had already begun shifting. Months later, Catherine and Sophie attended a major charity summit in London. Hundreds of organizations participated. Volunteers, community leaders, families. The atmosphere was electric. When Catherine spoke, the room fell silent. Her words were simple but powerful. The monarchy exists to serve. Sophie stood beside her proudly. The applause was thunderous. That night, every major newspaper carried the same headline: Catherine and Sophie lead the monarchy's new era. Inside Buckingham Palace, Camilla read the headline slowly. For a long moment, she simply stared at the page. Then she folded the paper and set it aside. The pressure was undeniable now. Not from confrontation, not from rebellion, but from something far more powerful: public trust. Weeks later, Camilla attended a formal event at Buckingham Palace. Guests mingled under glittering chandeliers. Across the room, Catherine and Sophie stood together speaking with charity leaders. They laughed warmly with guests, listening attentively to stories. Camilla watched silently. For the first time, she noticed something clearly. They weren't trying to overshadow her. They were simply doing what came naturally, connecting with people, and that connection was reshaping the monarchy itself. Charles approached quietly. "You're watching them," he said gently. Camilla sighed. "Yes." Charles smiled. "They're doing exactly what we hoped the next generation would do." Camilla looked again at Catherine and Sophie. The pressure she felt wasn't hostility. It was the realization that the monarchy was moving forward, and she was no longer at the center of it. Later that evening, Catherine approached Camilla. "Your Majesty." Camilla turned. "Yes," Catherine spoke softly. "We're planning a joint mental health initiative next year." Camilla raised an eyebrow. "With Sophie?" "Yes." Catherine paused. "We'd like you to be involved." Camilla blinked. "You would." Catherine smiled warmly. "The monarchy works best when we work together." For a moment, Camilla said nothing. Then she nodded slowly. "Very well." Across the room, Sophie watched with a knowing smile. The quiet strategy had never been about winning. It had been about strengthening the institution. And now, slowly but surely, the monarchy was adapting to a new era. An era led not by loud power struggles, but by calm leadership, compassion, and quiet strength. At the center of it stood Catherine and Sophie, two women who had changed the balance of the royal family without ever raising their voices. And the world had noticed. Note, the following is a fictional, creative royal drama continuation inspired by public figures. Thin streaks slid down the tall palace windows, blurring the view of the courtyard below. Inside the queen's private sitting room, Camilla, queen consort, sat with a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. The newspapers were spread across the table. Every headline seemed to echo the same message: new royal era emerging. Public adoration for Catherine and Sophie. Future of the monarchy taking shape. Camilla closed one of the papers slowly. Across the hall, aides moved quietly, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets. The palace always felt busy, but today something felt different. A shift. Not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable. Later that morning, King Charles III entered the room carrying a red dispatch box. He paused when he noticed Camilla staring out the window. "You're awake early," he said gently. Camilla didn't turn around. "Have you seen the papers?" Charles set the box on the desk. "I rarely read them anymore." Camilla gave a small sigh. "Well, perhaps you should." Charles sat down calmly. "What's troubling you?" Camilla hesitated. "It feels like the palace is changing without us noticing." Charles studied her carefully. "The monarchy has always changed." Camilla shook her head. "This feels different." Charles smiled faintly. "That's because the next generation is stepping forward." Camilla's expression tightened. "You mean Catherine, Princess of Wales, and Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh," Charles added. Camilla finally turned. "They're building something." Charles nodded. "Yes." "And you're comfortable with that?" Charles leaned back in his chair. "Camilla, the monarchy cannot remain frozen in time." He spoke softly but firmly. "Our role now is to guide, not control." Camilla didn't reply, but the words stayed with her. Across London at Kensington Palace, the atmosphere felt far lighter. Catherine sat at a long table surrounded by advisors, charity leaders, and staff. A large presentation screen displayed the outline of a new project. The initiative focused on supporting young families across Britain, combining mental health resources, childcare support, and education programs. Catherine stood at the front of the room. "We're not creating something new," she explained. "We're strengthening what already exists." The staff listened carefully. She continued, "If we connect charities instead of letting them compete for attention, the impact multiplies." A senior advisor nodded. "That's why this partnership with Sophie matters." Catherine smiled. Sophie entered the room at that exact moment. "Did someone mention me?" she joked. Laughter rippled around the table. Catherine handed her a folder. "We're finalizing the national tour." Sophie glanced through the schedule. Manchester, Edinburgh, Cardiff, Belfast. That's ambitious, Sophie said. Catherine shrugged lightly. People need to feel the monarchy is present. Sophie looked impressed. You really are redefining the role. Catherine's smile softened. I'm just trying to continue what the late Queen Elizabeth II started. Back at Buckingham Palace, Camilla met with two senior advisors. They sat across from her at a polished table. One of them spoke cautiously. Your Majesty, public polling shows very strong support for the Princess of Wales. Camilla gave a small, dry smile. I had noticed. The advisor continued. The collaboration with Sophie has strengthened that perception. Camilla tapped a finger lightly on the table. And what exactly are you suggesting? The second advisor answered, that the palace should embrace the partnership. Camilla raised an eyebrow. Meaning, public unity. Camilla leaned back. Interesting. She knew exactly what they meant. If she resisted Catherine and Sophie, the press would frame it as a rivalry. If she supported them, the narrative changed. The monarchy would appear united. Camilla stood and walked slowly to the window. Sometimes power wasn't about blocking someone's rise. Sometimes it was about deciding how to stand beside it. At Windsor Castle, Prince William sat with a tablet reviewing news coverage. He smiled slightly. Catherine entered carrying tea. You look amused, she said. William showed her the screen. A headline read, Catherine and Sophie become the monarchy's most trusted duo. Catherine sighed softly. I wish they wouldn't frame it like that. William laughed. You mean the press doing what the press always does? Catherine sat beside him. I don't want it to look like competition. William nodded thoughtfully. But you can't control the narrative entirely. He squeezed her hand. What matters is the work. Catherine glanced toward the garden outside. Children's laughter echoed faintly from the lawn where Prince George of Wales, Princess Charlotte of Wales, and Prince Louis of Wales were playing. That's the future, Catherine said quietly. William followed her gaze. And you're protecting it. 2 weeks later, Buckingham Palace hosted a major charity summit. Hundreds of organizations attended. The grand ballroom glittered with chandeliers as guests gathered. Cameras flashed. Royal correspondents whispered eagerly. Because tonight something unusual was happening. Camilla had personally invited Catherine and Sophie to present their joint initiative. When the three women entered the room together, the effect was immediate. The crowd stood. Applause filled the hall. Catherine stepped to the podium first. Her speech was warm, thoughtful, and direct. The monarchy exists because of the people we serve, she said. And tonight is about strengthening that connection. Next, Sophie spoke. Her voice carried quiet confidence. Every charity here represents hope for someone who needs it. Finally, Camilla approached the podium. The room grew still. She paused briefly before speaking. The strength of the monarchy has always come from its ability to adapt. Her eyes moved toward Catherine and Sophie. And tonight I'm proud to support the next chapter of that tradition. The applause was thunderous. For the first time in months, the press didn't write about tension. They wrote about unity. Later that evening, the three women gathered in a private reception room. Catherine smiled warmly. Thank you for supporting the initiative. Camilla lifted her glass. It's a worthy project. Sophie chuckled. That's diplomatic. Camilla actually laughed. Perhaps. She studied Catherine for a moment. You've handled the pressure well. Catherine answered honestly. I didn't expect it. Camilla nodded slowly. Leadership rarely announces itself in advance. There was a moment of understanding between them. Not friendship exactly, but respect. Over the following months, the royal schedule began to shift. Catherine and Sophie continued their national tour. Camilla focused on literacy programs and cultural events. Instead of competing, their roles began to complement each other. The public noticed, and so did the palace staff. One evening, an advisor spoke quietly to King Charles. Your Majesty, public confidence in the monarchy has increased significantly this quarter. Charles smiled gently. That's good to hear. The advisor added something interesting. Much of the credit is going to the collaboration between Catherine and Sophie. Charles chuckled softly. Yes, I suspected as much. One quiet evening, Camilla walked alone through the gardens of Buckingham Palace. The air was cool. Spring flowers had begun to bloom along the paths. She thought about the last few months, the tension, the headlines, the subtle shift in public attention. At first, she had seen Catherine and Sophie as pressure. Now she understood something different. They weren't rivals. They were the monarchy's future, and perhaps her role now was to help that future succeed. From across the garden, Charles approached. "You're deep in thought," he said. Camilla smiled faintly. "I was just realizing something." "And what's that?" Camilla looked toward the palace windows glowing in the evening light. "The monarchy isn't shrinking." Charles raised an eyebrow. "No, it's evolving." Charles smiled warmly. "Yes." They walked slowly back toward the palace. Inside, new plans were already forming, new projects, new partnerships. And at the center of it all were two women whose quiet determination had reshaped the royal landscape: Catherine and Sophie. Not through confrontation, not through power plays, but through patience, compassion, and steady leadership. And the monarchy was stronger because of it. The autumn wind swept across the long lawns of Windsor Castle, scattering golden leaves across the ancient stone pathways. Inside the castle's private conference room, a meeting was underway that few outside the palace even knew about. At the long oak table sat King Charles III, quietly reviewing briefing papers. Across from him were two women whose influence had been growing steadily inside the royal household: Catherine, Princess of Wales, and Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. The atmosphere was calm but serious, because the monarchy was entering another delicate moment. Charles placed the papers down and looked toward Catherine. "The Commonwealth tour," he said. "I want you to lead it." For a brief moment, Catherine seemed surprised. "Me?" she asked softly. Charles nodded. "Yes, the public response to your recent initiatives has been remarkable." Sophie smiled knowingly from across the table. Charles continued. "The tour will include Canada, Australia, and New Zealand." Catherine exchanged a glance with Sophie. It was an enormous responsibility. Royal tours were never just ceremonial. They were diplomatic missions that could strengthen or strain relationships across the Commonwealth. "Of course," Catherine said gently. "I'd be honored." Charles leaned back. "And I'd like Sophie to join you for part of the tour." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "Now that is interesting." Charles smiled faintly. "You two work well together." But outside that room, the news would cause far more reaction than Charles anticipated. 2 days later, the announcement was quietly released. Royal reporters immediately began analyzing every detail. And inside Buckingham Palace, the reaction was mixed. In her private sitting room, Camilla, Queen Consort, read the briefing with a thoughtful expression. Catherine leading the tour, she murmured. Her private secretary nodded carefully. "The king believes it signals the monarchy's future." Camilla set the document down slowly. "And where exactly does that leave the present?" The secretary remained silent, because the truth was obvious. The spotlight would follow Catherine everywhere. Across London at Kensington Palace, the mood was far more energetic. Catherine's office was buzzing with activity. Staff members moved quickly between desks, coordinating travel schedules, security briefings, and charity visits. Sophie sat beside Catherine, reviewing the itinerary. "This is intense," Sophie said. Catherine laughed softly. "Royal tours always are." Sophie tapped the page. 3 countries in 2 weeks. Catherine shrugged. "People deserve to see that the monarchy still values its global relationships." Sophie studied her for a moment. "You know this tour will make headlines." Catherine sighed slightly. "I know." Sophie leaned back in her chair. "And not all of them will be friendly." Catherine smiled gently. "That's part of the job." Later that evening, Catherine sat with Prince William in the garden at Kensington Palace. The city lights flickered softly beyond the palace walls. William poured 2 cups of tea. "So," he said, smiling slightly, "leader of the Commonwealth tour." Catherine rolled her eyes playfully. "Don't start." William chuckled. "I'm proud of you." Catherine looked thoughtful. "It's a lot of pressure." William nodded. "But you're ready." From the nearby lawn came the distant sound of laughter. Their children, Prince George of Wales, Princess Charlotte of Wales and Prince Louis of Wales were playing under the watchful eye of a nanny. Catherine watched them quietly. Everything we do now shapes their future. William squeezed her hand. And you're shaping it beautifully. The following morning, Camilla attended a literacy charity event in London. Reporters gathered outside. At first, the questions were routine. Then one journalist asked, Your Majesty, do you believe the Princess of Wales leading the Commonwealth tour signals a shift in royal leadership? Camilla paused. For a moment, cameras flashed rapidly. She answered carefully. The Princess of Wales represents an important part of the monarchy's future. Another reporter followed quickly. Does that concern you? Camilla gave a composed smile. The monarchy has always evolved. Her answer was diplomatic, but headlines would still interpret it in many different ways. A week before the tour was scheduled to begin, something unexpected happened. Inside Kensington Palace, Catherine sat with Sophie reviewing a new briefing. Sophie frowned. This can't be right. Catherine looked up. What is it? Sophie slid the document across the table. Canada has requested a change. Catherine scanned the page. The Canadian government wanted the royal tour shortened. Significantly. It's political, Sophie said quietly. Catherine nodded. Royal visits could easily become entangled in domestic politics, and any misstep could create controversy. This complicates things, Catherine admitted. Sophie crossed her arms thoughtfully, which means the press will jump on it. Catherine sighed. Then we handle it calmly. That evening, senior advisors gathered again at Buckingham Palace. Charles listened as they explained the situation. One advisor spoke carefully. The Canadian government is facing internal pressure regarding the monarchy. Charles nodded slowly, and Catherine's tour is caught in the middle. Across the room, Camilla spoke quietly. Perhaps a joint approach would help. The advisors turned toward her. Camilla continued. If Catherine represents the future of the monarchy, perhaps the present should support her more visibly. Charles studied her thoughtfully. You mean joining the tour? Camilla smiled slightly. Not entirely. She paused. But perhaps for the opening ceremony. The room fell silent. It was a strategic move. Instead of appearing sidelined, Camilla would appear supportive and unified. Charles nodded. That might work. The next morning, Catherine received the update. She read the message twice, then looked up at Sophie. Camilla wants to join the first stop of the tour. Sophie blinked. That's unexpected. Catherine thought carefully. It's also smart. Sophie laughed softly. You mean politically? Catherine nodded. It sends a message of unity. Sophie studied her friend for a moment. You really don't see this as competition, do you? Catherine shook her head gently. The monarchy is in a race. Late that night, Catherine walked alone through the quiet halls of Kensington Palace. The building was silent. Moonlight streamed through the tall windows. She paused beside a portrait of Queen Elizabeth II. For years, Elizabeth had carried the weight of the monarchy with quiet strength. Catherine wondered what advice she might have given in this moment. Probably something simple. Stay steady. Serve the people. Ignore the noise. Catherine smiled softly. Those principles had guided the monarchy for decades, and they would guide her too. The palace courtyard buzzed with preparation. Cars arrived. Security teams checked every detail. Journalists gathered behind barriers. Inside the palace, Catherine and Sophie shared a quiet moment before the tour began. Sophie adjusted Catherine's coat. Ready? Catherine took a deep breath. As ready as anyone can be. Sophie grinned. Just remember, millions of people will be watching. Catherine laughed softly. No pressure then. Outside, cameras flashed as the palace gates opened. The royal tour that would define the monarchy's next chapter was about to begin. And the world was watching closely. Not just for diplomacy. Not just for ceremony. But for something deeper. The evolving balance of power inside the royal family itself, and whether Catherine and Sophie's quiet leadership would continue reshaping the monarchy.